Hello, everyone. We're very pleased that you've joined us today for this conversation on the risks that are posed by gifts and hospitality and best practices in training to mitigate those risks. I look forward to a very lively discussion. My name is Leslie Benton, and I am the Vice President at the Center for Responsible Enterprise and Trade. And we're very pleased today to be joined by Farzad Barkhadari, who's the president of Click for Compliance. And we're going to be talking about a number of things, sort of the challenges that are posed by corruption, what's included in the idea of gifts, hospitality, and entertainment, the role of training in anti-corruption compliance programs and how you can get started, and some of the best practices that we see, the two of us, as we work with companies around the globe to mitigate these issues. So we're going to start, I thought, with a little bit of context setting. I'm going to assume that a lot of you are very familiar with this issue, but for those of you for whom this is new, or if you'd like a little refresher, we thought some context would be a little bit helpful at the beginning. So all you have to do, as you know, is pick up a newspaper and you see the significant risk that corruption poses for companies today, really wherever they're operating. And we know that the United States certainly is very vigorously enforcing its anti-bribery law, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. We see that continuing at a very aggressive pace. Here you see the top 10 fines. The amounts are just incredible, very significant. And you'll notice that the cases really are primarily here in the top 10 against foreign headquartered companies. So it's both companies headquartered outside the U.S. and companies headquartered inside the U.S. that are at risk because of the broad jurisdictional reach of the law. Looking back at 2014, it was another notable year for FCPA enforcement. Last year, I think there were 10 corporate resolutions that were brought by the DOJ, the SEC, or both. And we're seeing a lot of activity this year as well, particularly on the SEC side. I think last year, to combined, the DOJ and the SEC together collected $1.5 billion roughly, so again, just tremendous. There were 14 individual actions last year as well, and we know from the recently released Yates memo that the emphasis that the U.S. enforcement authorities at least are going to place on individual prosecutions will certainly continue. Very important for our discussion today, the cases that we saw last year involved sort of the perennial themes that we see year after year, gifts and entertainment being really at the top of the list, the use of merchandise, and of course, consulting fees and commissions paid to third parties. Again, sort of we see that year after year, so those are really high-risk areas for companies that they need to pay attention to. But I also wanted to mention that the U.S. isn't alone in these efforts anymore. I mean, we used to say that this was a U.S. issue only, but that's really not the case. We're starting to see other countries enforcing their laws. We know that Germany and Switzerland in particular are very active. We're beginning to see some enforcement out of the UK. And of course, everyone knows what's going on in Brazil with entry into force of the Clean Company Act, which took effect in January of last year, but also with the investigations into Petrobras, which has just been all-encompassing. It's reached, of course, the state-owned oil company, but also the state-owned power company, the highest levels of politics in that country, and private companies as well. We've seen China last year bring its first foreign bribery case against GlaxoSmithKline, the UK pharmaceutical company, on charges of commercial bribery for allegedly bribing doctors and other healthcare professionals. In Europe, we see cases brought by Norway, by the Netherlands. And another really interesting trend that I like to mention is the rising influence of the multilateral development banks. I think you see on this slide that the African Development Bank has been particularly active. And we know, they operate primarily in emerging markets and really reach, again, like the FCPA, they reach companies sort of operating in a variety of different places. They're now routinely conducting anti-corruption investigations of their bank-funded projects. And the consequences are really far-reaching, including debarment from bank-funded projects, but also referral to country authorities like the DOJ to pursue those cases as well. So, reading the tea leaves, I think we can expect to see continued aggressive enforcement in the U.S. and elsewhere. I think we can continue to see a focus on individuals. We're going to see cross-border cooperation and enforcement in multiple jurisdictions, like we're seeing with Brazil and the United States, like we saw with the Alstom case with France last year. So this is sort of the new normal for companies. And in particular, we're going to see really, really significant scrutiny of company compliance programs, and in particular of their training programs. So that's a little bit of context for you guys out there. Farzad, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, Leslie, that was I've heard it before when we practiced, but that was just a fantastic overview for everybody. I think you did it so concisely there. The two main points that just stick out in my mind is even the largest one, the Siemens case at $800 million, that was just the U.S. part of it. There were still hundreds of millions of dollars that were also from the EU. So that's significant there, a total of well over $1 billion. And then just emphasizing something else you said regarding the individuals, at these conferences where the SEC or the DOJ speak, they say that it's not just a byproduct or a side collateral damage from these investigations about the individuals, but they're specifically targeting individuals. They made it very clear that they think that corporate fines don't really send the message and may not change behavior. So by specifically looking for and targeting individuals, either complicit in or leading or having knowledge of these bribery schemes, corruption schemes, they've made that a goal of theirs, and they repeat it every chance they get. So I think that's the other thing that really stands out in my mind. So thanks for the overview. So we're going to focus on gifts, travel, and entertainment, and we just want to make sure with that we didn't give the background of the FCPA, the details of the law, assuming everybody's familiar with it. But why gifts, travel, and entertainment? How do they relate to the FCPA? And the key thing is there that it relates to something of value, because under the FCPA, it's anything of value that can be considered a bribe if it influences somebody's decision-making improperly. So there's a broad spectrum here, and they range from things that are called nominal items, like coffee cups or buying a coffee, getting a T-shirt, and they range up. And I often, when I type these in, when I type the word Rolex, I think everybody knows that. But case after case, you see the Rolex, the jewelry, the fancy travel, etc. So I always I smile when I say it, but it's just amazing that it's still happening. So if you look up if you move down the slide, you'll see kind of a scale of how things from nominal to really expensive items that could certainly influence people. And that spectrum has to be dealt with by individual companies. Now, sometimes a mistake is just to say, be reasonable. And people can apply the label reasonable and they can justify everything. So what you have to do is really look at these and see which ones you feel comfortable with. Would they influence? Does it matter by country? Does a certain value of a meal in one country, could that be very low, whereas in certain countries it could be high? You have to grapple with all those things. But at the end of the day, what you have to make sure you're doing is looking at it, seeing what's realistic, and applying it to your business. To me, a Rolex, it just doesn't seem applicable anywhere. There is a defense under the FCPA for gifts, travel, or entertainment that are related to the promotion, demonstration of products and services, or performing a contract. So it seems logical to say, well, I understand going to a meal while you're working, while you're having a couple days of meetings, going to a meal, a nice meal. That could be part of that. But it's harder when you move into gifts or move into lavish items. It's harder to justify those as part of the promotion, demonstration, explanation, performing a contract. So that's something you always have to be wary of. Leslie, anything you'd like to comment on these?
No, I agree with everything that you've said. I mean, we know, that the FCPA does not prohibit providing gifts or hospitality per se. And I should say, we're talking about the FCPA, but, this is the UK Bribery Act, other relevant laws. These are concerns that you should keep in mind, wherever you're working and under whatever the relevant law is. And as I mentioned before, with the 2014 cases, we know that the history of enforcement just highlights that gifts, hospitality, entertainment, meals, travel, all of these things are high-risk practices and should be conducted with great care and attention to compliance, so that they don't end up, sort of appearing as bribery. So it's the training of these on these issues is really imperative. It's so important that your employees, but not just your employees, your third parties, understand what the relevant law prohibits, what your policy requires, whether it's pre-approvals or limits on the amount that can be spent, or other similar controls. So.
Right, and there's also another kind of angle to this on that sliding scale of sometimes for let's say mid-level employees, maybe certain class of travel for business or certain fancy restaurants may seem very lavish, but certainly executives of larger corporations may be typical for them to travel business class or first class or go to a higher end restaurant. So again, the best programs are often looked at really understanding the circumstances of how you do business and making reasonable decisions. Nobody ever wants to put in a really tight prohibition that doesn't make sense to their business, because then you're at odds in the compliance office or the legal office. You're at odds with the business folks. And the best way to do it is really to understand what your business folks need and what they do, and you can certainly let them know that certain actions are risky, but try to get the bulk of their actions into a format where you both agree on what is reasonable, on dollar limits for meals, etc. So that's really a good way to look at it. You can move to the next slide. So again, we wanted to put in case studies because no matter how many times we go over these and we hear about this, there's always a case where it comes up and you're a little shocked that certain things of value are given, gifts, travel, fancy entertainment, the night before a procurement decision is made. Those are things that are trying to influence. And when you're trying to influence improperly with something of extreme value or not really justifiable value, those are the things that are considered violating the anti-corruption laws. So this one was really interesting because to me, the company kept saying that the expenses of the gifts, travel, and entertainment were not material. They were not material to our consolidated financial statements. And that's one of the tricks or one of the gotchas of the anti-corruption laws. Even small amounts of possible bribes are considered significant or material in the world of bribery. So even though it's somewhat at conflicts with the SEC or financial statements, a small bribe is still noteworthy. So they made a voluntary disclosure to the SEC. And by making that voluntary disclosure, they've recognized that bribes are in fact important, the kind of things that should be disclosed. But on the flip side, they're also saying that expenses were not material to the financial statements. So I think that highlights how important bribery is in what companies should be disclosing these days, and how the government authorities are interested, and they think the public should know, the investors should know. So why are they disclosing immaterial amounts? Because it involves corruption, and that's a key point to make. It often doesn't make sense. It's counterintuitive.
Absolutely, and I would just say in some of the companies that we work with, this is really one of the issues that you have to train your, financial and accounting staff on. Too often this is just not something that they understand. So, really important point to emphasize.
And this one, we just wanted to remind you, this is a classic catch, is let's say you are giving cash, jewelry, fancy gifts, meals, you're trying to influence. Let's say that happens. Let's say under the investigation for some reason, and I'm not talking about the BMS case, but let's say under the investigation it's determined that that in fact was not illegal corruption or bribery. What often gets companies is that even if their gifts, travel, entertainment was legitimate, what happens is they were worried about it, so they recorded it incorrectly. So instead of calling it cash or jewelry, they called it consulting expenses. And that's their violation. So even if because as you remember, under the FCPA, or many of the global anti-corruption law, books, records, and controls, you have to keep accurate books, records, and controls. So just by inaccurately recording those expenses, there's your violation right there. So that's a problem with if you're going to spend on these things, at least record it properly. You should always comply with the policy as to what you're spending on and the dollar values, etc. But no matter what, always record it properly, because then even if the gift turns out to be legitimate, you have your violation right there. Now, I'm not encouraging people to go spend on the cash and jewelry, etc. But in case you do, no matter what you do, always record it properly, because then that you can at least avoid that aspect of it. Leslie, anything you think to add on that?
No, I don't have anything to add. I think you said it well. So we'll move on now to sort of getting into some of the nitty-gritty on how do you train on these issues. We've highlighted some of the problems, so we'll get into some detail now. So as we've mentioned, when you're thinking about gifts, hospitality, entertainment, you need to think really broadly. What are some of the common items? We've listed some of them here. It can be a fancy meal. It can be an event. It could be a Rolex or something smaller. And, whether, again, I said it earlier, but it's given by your employees, but also by your third parties. So if you've got third parties working on your behalf or for your benefit, and they are providing these items or hospitality, that creates legal risk for you as well. And as we said before,
one of the things. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
The one I want to point out is the number third. It's I hate to say my favorite, but it's the one that often runs people up. Is they say, let's say you're a U.S. headquartered company and it's happening in a different country. They say, you don't understand our local culture. And they kind of play the card that by acting the way you're acting, by limiting gifts, limiting certain courtesies, entertainment, you're not being respectful of their local culture, local country, local ways of doing business, local holidays. And that's a tough one because it's a tough thing to always react to the possibility that you're not being culturally sensitive. But in today's world, your corporate policy of gifts, travel, entertainment, meal limits, etc., that trumps the local culture. It's got to. It's a hard thing to say. It's a hard thing for people to hear. But in fact, you've got to come to common ground and explain it in a way that, we're talking about the law. We're talking about where we certainly respect your cultures, but let's see if there are other ways where we can respect that culture without giving certain things of value, etc. So it's a real tough one. And there are many ways. Happy to discuss this offline because it could take a long time to discuss it. But ways to counter that by explaining what the laws are, or if they understand them already, just explaining that this is the way you do it. But there are other ways that you can comply or respect the cultures while still complying with the law. But it's a real tough one. And oftentimes, I've seen compliance folks say, well, it made sense because they do it there regularly, so it must be okay. But the answer is it's actually not okay if it's violating your policy, whether a dollar amount, a gift limit, the types of gifts, the value of gifts, etc.
Absolutely. And I'll talk a little bit about the next bullet, even small repeated benefits. So, while we know there's no minimum threshold below which, an expenditure will never be viewed as corrupt, a smaller expense is likely safer because items of nominal value are just less likely to influence the decision maker. Right? So we know that. So, we see companies giving small, token, infrequent gifts of nominal value that are not provided with any expectation of a return favor. And, those likely fall outside the crosshairs of the FCPA or other relevant laws for that matter. But if you're doing it repeatedly, that can get you into a problem. So you don't want to give frequent gifts, even small gifts, to the same individual or group, because we've seen that in the cases where in the aggregate, it really adds up to something that's substantial. So this is another important point that, yes, they're small, yes, they're nominal, but if you're doing it, providing the same person repeated benefits, you could get yourself into trouble. And do you have anything else to add on that one, Farzad?
I think you may have mentioned early on, Leslie, about the third parties. As we often, I remember when I was in house, there was a situation we were trying to throw an event at the Sheraton in whatever country, and we found out who was invited and what the agenda was, the entertainment value, and the gifts that were being given, and they were all much higher, particularly given the fact that government officials were invited. So we talked to them about it and explained, and then 2 weeks later we get the exact same event, exact same date, but it's sponsored by the partner or the third party, the reseller, the distributor. Choose your term for third party. And again, it's a thing of value from you, from your third parties, going to the end customer for the business you're trying to obtain. None of those are allowed. So you just have to make sure it's always a catch on everything is and third parties.
Absolutely. I mean, in some of the things that I think we've seen that probably are okay, again, the very small gifts that are perishable sometimes, such as plants or something that you can consume, that you can eat, that an entire office can share instead of just one individual. We've seen, gifts with a corporate logo. I think Farzad might have mentioned that before, that don't have a real retail value. Sample products of nominal value from your own company. Certainly never give cash or cash equivalents like a gift card or something like that. That's always a no. Giving gifts for official rather than personal use, sort of related to what I said about, a box of chocolates that an entire office can consume. And it's just important whatever you're doing, because these rules are different for different companies and in different markets, but just to clear your gifts through your compliance department, to try to present them openly and in front of groups of people. Those are some of the things that can work for companies.
Yeah, I think, and what we used to do was we'd have these discussions not half an hour before the event. So often we'd get the email saying, hey, there's an event tonight and this is what's going on. We have to bring X, Y, and Z because it's the general manager's 25th anniversary, and if we want to stay in their good graces. So it's happening. You've got 2 hours. There's a time zone difference. You don't have all the details, and those conversations are never fun. So what we would do is, outside of the realm of we're going somewhere in 2 minutes, we'd sit down and say, all right, what are your common situations? Are they meals? Are they events? And then we kind of broke it down to say, look, for events, you're always going to have advanced planning. It's not going to happen in minutes. So why don't you give us some background, let us know who's there, what's typical in the country. We want to be respectful, but we can't violate these laws. And if you have that discussion with them outside of the heat of the moment, they often go much better. And then you can meet a lot of the sales and marketing. You can meet a lot of their needs by doing that. Okay, meals, typically aren't planned long in advance. So perhaps we can agree on certain types of restaurants. And if it's somebody more senior, yes, you can go to that higher end restaurant. But by having these discussions, what happens is you earn the trust also of your sales, marketing, your folks in the field that are doing these things. And that's always helpful to gain that trust and let them know you don't want to just say, no gifts, no meals, no hospitality, no this. So I often found that was very helpful to engage in that dialogue.
Absolutely. So I think we'll move on to sort of discuss, okay, now, we understand the issues, what's allowable, what isn't allowable. So how do you train your employees on these issues? And I'll start out with this, and then we'll let Farzad mention. I wanted to, his thoughts, but I want to tell you a little bit about an experience I just had. I just got back from Malaysia. I am part of a U.S. delegation to an international committee constituted by the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, and we are developing an international anti-bribery management system standard. If any of you want more information on that, because I could talk for a long time just about that subject, I'd be happy to talk to folks offline. We expect the standard to be available next year. But, we're still in the development phase, and, one of the topics that we were talking about this time that I thought would surely be uncontroversial was training. What kind of training do you do? Who should be trained? How often? what level of detail? Should you record it? Should you document it? So this is still, I mentioned it just to show you that, even globally, this is still something that companies are really grappling with. And it's something that you have to do whether you're a small company, a medium-sized company, or a large company, whether you have a dispersed workforce, whether you've got, millennials that you're worrying about who consume information differently now. So these are all of the issues that we're talking about and just sort of highlighting really the importance of getting it right. So it's important to be comprehensive and to train on the main topics, what conduct is prohibited, and what does your policy say. I mean, that's the basics, and everybody should get that. Most companies like to use a variety of formats, some live in-person training, and also e-learning. It's helpful to have a variety of different learning, formats that you present your training in to account for different learning styles. We know that millennials really love technology, and we'll get to that in a little while. We know that scenario-based training is really helpful because you can focus it on the kinds of risks and scenarios that particular segments of your employee population or your third-party population will actually encounter. You want your training to be helpful to them. And that's one way to sell it to employees. This is to help you. It's to help you do your job without running afoul of the law, even unintentionally. It's important to take a risk-based approach on who to train. You train all employees across the organization, that means globally, who pose more than a low risk, for example, but have an articulable reason to explain who's in the scope of your training. Here we've got, should you train your C-suite? Absolutely, you should train your C-suite, and you should train your boards of directors if you have them, or whatever your supervisory authority is if you're not a U.S.-based company. It's really critical for boards of directors and senior leaders to clearly understand and own their own role in compliance program development and oversight. That's just really key. We know that boards and senior managers are responsible for setting tone at the top. They can't do that adequately if they don't understand and appreciate what their own roles are and what their risks are. So it's very important. It can be challenging to secure time to train those folks who are at a higher level, but it's still essential. So that's something that we really want to stress. I think it's important to make training accessible and engaging and focus on role. Same with third parties. They present a significant legal risk and should be trained. A lot of companies say, well, it's really hard to do that, but you can use technology to help you. That's, again, we're going to talk about that in a little while. And then also to think about specialized training, which you would want to vary by role or by geography. Again, you want to take a risk-based approach here. I mentioned, and this is always my pet thing to mention, I mentioned earlier that it's really important to train your financial folks. And part of it is something that Farzad mentioned earlier, that when you're monitoring your program, what kind of violations are you looking for? If you're only looking for material problems, you're missing a whole lot. And sometimes I've found in working with companies that sort of the finance and accounting folks don't recognize red flags or indicia of corruption. So, giving specialized training according to role is really important. I've worked with some compliance officers who don't, in the compliance function who never been trained on how to do an internal investigation. Those are all really important things to think about. You're giving your general training, and then you want to think about some specialized training as well. Farzad, I'm sure you have something to add here.
Yeah, I liked your point on the financial training the financial folks. I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with the situation in which the internal audit team or external audit team comes back from a country and gives it the green light, but then right away there's an anti-corruption or a bribery issue, a payment issue, and you're in that situation where they're saying, let me just get this straight. We just passed our internal audit, and now you're finding these small little things that could be corruption risks. And I think that's exactly what the specialized training is. There's the audit team, let's say they're focusing on revenue recognition or certain balance sheet items, but that's different from a fraud audit. And when Leslie, when you're mentioning the anti-corruption specialized training for the financial folks, it's got to include both. I think it's not a good use of time to only do for instance, revenue recognition or more financial matters, and not understand the fraud if you're only doing one tour of a country for an audit team. So I definitely agree with that. And then just on the unique risks, I mean, some companies say, well, okay, we want this certain type of training, but if you have more third parties and 90% of your revenue, let's say in China, is through third parties, well, that's much more important training than certain other things, certain other emphasis on certain other types of training. So you have to understand, for instance, high tech, very multi-tiered distributor network. You have a master distributor, country distributors, VARs, resellers, et cetera. Whereas other industries like defense, there's usually only one or two in a country. So that greatly impacts and changes your profile. Some industries have that high exposure to government officials. For instance, healthcare. Most people are most people aware that doctors, nurses, university employees can be government officials in certain countries? That's the kind of training you have to put out there, and that may not matter to other companies or entities. So that's the kind of thing you have to focus on. So I agreed with everything you said, Leslie. I thought that was a great overview.
Okay. One of the things that we wanted to sort of highlight is, how you can reinforce your training. Most companies like to give sort of an annual general overview. Sometimes you start, as soon as an employee is hired, you'll give them training, and then annually thereafter at some, sort of regular interval. You can also use, and I think it's sort of becoming a best practice, these short modules to reinforce the learning. It helps, I think, overburdened learners or those who feel that they're overburdened and don't have a lot of time to devote to training to provide sort of short bursts. It makes the most of your learner's ability to concentrate, and it fits into the realities of the learner's job. So you can really, you can focus on one element at a time, as opposed to sort of your yearly training, which is a much more broad brush. That has been shown in studies to help retention of the information, because learners can absorb and remember, very specific elements in just a few minutes. And again, here it's an opportunity to tailor your training to specific learners or specific times of the year, if it's around the holidays and you want to talk about gifts and hospitality. But it's just a good way to focus your training and to reinforce the more broad annual training that you'll be giving your employees and third parties.
Yeah, the timely training is exactly it. As you know, pick your religion, pick your country. As we approach the, quote, holiday season, it's time to remind people. And based on the studies that show most people actually want to comply, the people that are violating the law, violating your policy, that's a small minority. And most of them that do, often they did not know, and they forgot. And I know on the smaller side, that is more understandable. So just remind them, a simple message out there. Remember, I know mooncakes are popular. I know red envelopes are popular, but that's not the way we do things here. This is what we recommend. Here's our policy. It can be a 1-minute little burst training. It could be communications. It can be some kind of town hall meeting. But this is the time to remind people, because most people appreciate that reminder, and they file it away in their head and say, all right, I remember that. I'm not supposed to do that. And that really helps with your compliance program.
That's true, and I'll mention.
Short module. Go ahead.
Oh, sure. I just wanted to mention, here again, the Morgan Stanley case, which, I think is it's the one case that we have where a company was not prosecuted, and the enforcement authorities here in the U.S. went after only the individual. And one of the reasons was because of the really robust training program that Morgan Stanley had in place. And they used this sort of method. They had trained, I think, the bad actor, something like 7 times in the last 12 to 18 months on the compliance program and his responsibilities thereunder. And so it was it was one of the things that the DOJ mentioned in its press release when it declined to prosecute the company. So this is it's really important It's important for you so you're actually stopping bad behavior, and then it's important on the backside if you ever find yourself, sort of having to defend your program. So this was another one that we thought was really important. Can you get this one?
No, go ahead.
And this is just another really important one that we wanted to mention, sort of on leveraging technology. And I think, most everyone is doing this today. It's more cost effective. It's a way in which you can provide frequent training. It can save on your compliance function, travel costs. It's always important to have some in-person training, or it may be in certain high-risk situations, but certainly, leveraging technology is a way to get the, most bang for your buck in terms of your training program. And it also provides a way to track, what you're doing, to have evidence that your employees or your third parties are actually taking the training and completing it, and attesting to the fact that they understand your policy. So that's really important for you to have as well. What was that?
No, that sounds great.
Yeah, I think, one of the things I'm also seeing companies do in sort of terms of trends is making training available across a variety of different platforms, smartphones, tablets, computers. So that's another way in which you can use technology. And also I think it's a way to survey employees as well about their perceptions of the training. So not just getting evidence that they've completed it, but asking them, what did you think of it? Was it helpful to you? Did you understand? Is there something that you want to understand better? Is there something else we should cover? I mean, this is really important to helping you be able to measure the effectiveness of your training. So as part of the monitoring that you're going to do, you want to be measuring the effectiveness of your program across the board. This is one way that you can measure the effectiveness of training. And that's important. At least I know some of the folks that I talk to, that's important for them in terms of, maintaining their budget for training, maintaining the number of hours that they're allocated, among all of the different areas that, employees and third parties need to be trained on. So being able to demonstrate that your training is effective, that's certainly, leveraging technology to do that is a really important, point.
This is an area where you want the training to fit your company, and I'm going to move to the second aspect of it. We have a course that we created, and we showed it to some Silicon Valley companies, and they absolutely loved it. It was a real hit. The protagonist, or one of the guys in the course, he was wearing a T-shirt, and everybody loved it. It was very informal. So you showed the exact same course to a financial firm in New York, and they said, I would get fired if I showed this training course. It's so informal. It's so cartoony. I can't believe anyone would do that. So it just goes to show you the exact same course, how culturally it just, sometimes it matches, sometimes it doesn't. So you have to gauge your company's culture on, the formality, informality, the sophistication level. If your company's been doing training for years and years, they don't need the basics from, maybe for new hire courses you do, but they don't need the basics of the background of the laws, et cetera. So you have to gauge the simplicity, the complexity, et cetera. You have to give examples. The examples have to meet, if you're using terms that are not used in your industry or within your company, people won't like it. So you have to make sure you do things that it fits your company. Obviously your logo, your policies, your contact us page, some of the resources, any internal links, those all make a training course much more, ABC-like. And that's, if you work for ABC, that's what you want to see. So those are certain things that you have to do. You can do them inexpensively. You can go, full on and really customize the whole thing. But you just have to do a little bit and make it connect with your people. And that's why what Leslie mentioned about doing a survey in addition to just a quiz, polling people, making sure you understand how they liked it, not just did they complete it, but how did they like it. That's very important too.
Right, and I'll tell just a funny little anecdote that I heard just a few days ago. It was a company that was doing training, and they thought they had taken, culture and language into consideration, but they were going to sort of provide the same training to all their English speakers, wherever they happened to be in the globe. And they got in trouble because they had one slide that said, don't get caught with your hand in the cookie jar. And that just didn't translate at all. And they were really, they were just absolutely, I guess, dumbfounded that even their efforts to do this all in one language didn't even quite work. So that's just another example of how something very simple like that, you really do need to kind of think about, does your training fit and will it come across properly? Will people understand it? Even when you're using it in the same language but across a variety of different geographies. So I just thought that was kind of a funny story.
Great. I think we just got we're getting some questions in. I just wanted to mention this one because it's relevant to what we just said about specific tips for training on gifts and hospitality. And we're obviously covering it at a high level, but within your training, the things that you have to do are really put out these, don't say reasonable. Actually talk about your limits. Actually talk, if you have a dollar limit for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, which many companies do, mention it. If there's a ban on gifts within a certain time of a procurement decision, mention it. If there are different gift limitations, and this really, the specific tips for training, you've got to be clear about your policy. I'm not suggesting what the policy may be. Some companies ban everything all the way down to a cup of coffee. So what you have to do is make sure that if you have your policy, if you have got a clearly written policy, and that's our first step because that's what you're training on, make sure you mention it. Don't leave vague words like be reasonable. That's a good thing, but if you're not explaining what reasonable is, either in detail or with specific dollar amounts, that's not going to go over well. And then the other specific tip really goes to the unique risks. Some companies don't give charitable contributions. They don't make political contributions. Other companies, they're constantly asked for it. Maybe in the construction business and the healthcare business, they're often asked for that kind of reinvestment back into the society in which they're doing business. And if that's the kind of milieu in which your company plays, you've got to address that. You've got to let people know specifically. How do you react to that? Do you react yourself? Do you call your legal department? Do you call your investor relations department? What do you do specifically? The more specific help you can give people in your training, the better off they'll be. The more likely they will be to contact you or to follow the process. But if it's very vague and say gifts can get us in trouble, make sure you're reasonable and don't improperly influence people. That's going to be tough, and then you're subject to people interpreting it on their own. And I've had people say, yeah, it was a $400 bottle of wine. Yes, that's reasonable around here. So you don't want that to happen. So with regard to specific tips, be specific.
Absolutely. And I have sympathy for the question. As I said earlier, but I'm going to repeat, there is no nominal value under which we can tell you with absolute certainty that a gift or a meal will not be considered a bribe. And that's true under the FCPA, and I'm sure it's true under every other law. So you really are left to sort of craft these rules yourself. Most of the companies that I work with will have limits. They will have pre-approvals, so that you have to seek pre-approval so that someone from compliance or the legal department or very senior in the company makes a judgment call, in terms of things like the charitable contributions or political contributions or even, sponsorships for different kinds of events. Most companies will require approvals for that, and as part of the approval process, there will be due diligence done to ensure that it's legitimate, that there aren't government officials involved, or there's some assurance that this won't get you into trouble, but it is by no means a cut and dry issue. It's not sort of black and white. These are really difficult decisions that companies have to grapple with. But I agree with Farzad, you really need to be very specific and just very continually emphasize to your employees and third parties that this is a high-risk area. And if they have questions, they should come to you with questions or come to your compliance folks with questions before they act. So
I don't think we spoke about the other best practices, so maybe we can focus a little bit on this. To me, multi-language is key. A lot of companies say, you know what, we're an American company, everyone speaks English. But then you travel to the field, and they certainly do, but it's not at the level where they may feel comfortable taking training or understanding the concepts. So I think that under the sentencing guidelines, it's not just training; it's effective training. I think that's a real key to make it effective, is offering it in multiple languages. Now, if 30% of your operations are in Brazil and Mexico, and the bulk of it is, the rest of it is in the U.S. and let's say France, okay, so offer those languages. It doesn't have to be everything. Or if the majority is in one country, at least offer it in that. You can be reasonable in your approach, but oftentimes English only is a tough one.
Absolutely, and we've said this before.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say the same thing. We've talked about sort of the holiday season. It's a good time to use sort of burst training and remind people other problem times of the year you should be thinking about, when are you experiencing particular risks? And I see another question, and I'll just answer it here, about, should a company make annual anti-bribery training mandatory for all of its employees? And I think, that was one of the questions we were grappling with at this ISO event. Companies have a wide variety of employees. Do you need to make training available to everyone, including, your janitorial staff? Maybe not. But you really need to have an articulable reason for defining the scope in the way that you do. And I think most companies are going to mandatory training on an annual basis for all employees who present you with more than a very low bribery risk. It's important when you're thinking about mandatory training, though, if you're really going to do it, you really need to mean it. That means you need to track your completion rates. I think that's really, really important. Low completion rates can indicate that managers aren't holding their employees accountable for training, or that senior management's not really committed to the program. So if you're going to do it, you need to do it well. You need to set realistic completion deadlines. You need to follow through. Managers need to make sure that the employees that work in their units are meeting expectations. But I do think more and more companies are going to sort of mandatory annual training. Farzad, do you agree or have anything else to add on that?
Leslie?
Yes.
Can't hear Leslie anymore, so I hope you guys can hear me. One of the other things is really discussing pre-marketing your courses. In some companies, the CEO may send a message saying, take this training, and everybody jumps, everybody takes this training. In other companies, you kind of have to woo the employees a little bit more. Maybe the CEO sends one, then the general counsel or chief compliance officer, and then maybe the regional manager, somebody in EMEA, somebody in Asia Pac, and then the employees realize they have to take it. And, whatever your company culture is, make sure it matches. If it is a kind where one email is all it takes and if people jump, that's wonderful. But you have to make sure that when they get it, they're ready for it. Because oftentimes people may not think it's serious. They may think it's spam. They may think, I had so many other trainings. You have to let them know why it's important. You have to let them know that this is important to the company, the time frame, what's going on, who the email may come from, and just by the time they get that email saying, all right, you now have 30 days to take this training, it's just chances are it's much more likely to happen and you have higher completion rates, et cetera. And that's really the ultimate goal, where you want to be.
Great. Farzad, I hope you can hear me again.
Yep, I can now. Thanks.
Great. All right, great. Well, I'm here, and I thought next we would talk a little bit about how training fits into a broader anti-corruption program. So when we work with companies, this is the framework that we work with, sort of 7 categories that make up an effective compliance program. I know the Department of Justice in the last couple of years has started talking about 10 hallmarks of compliance. I've seen other numbers, but this is a framework that we use to sort of organize the way we think about this. These process categories would include all of the things that the Justice Department would want to see. And I want to talk about them a little bit and just how training should relate. Of course, with your policies and your procedures, you're going to be training on those. That's going to be the most important thing for you to be focused on. But with your anti-corruption compliance team, and by that we mean who's sort of responsible for the this issue within your company, and not just your compliance function, whatever that may be, if it's part of legal or if it's a separate compliance function, but really all of the parts of the company, sort of a cross-function that touch on this issue. So we've mentioned finance and accounting, audit, the sales, obviously procurement. When you're training, you should be thinking about all of those functions and how you might tailor training to each of those areas, and then monitoring to make sure that they all understand how they work together and what their role is. And again, the board, the C-suite, setting the tone at the top, having that kind of senior accountability. Training is really important to support that function. You should change your training as you do your risk assessments. Some companies do that on an annual basis, others, some other kind of periodic basis. But as you're encountering new risks, whether it's entering a new market, entering a new joint venture, hiring a different type of third party, that risk assessment should be informing your training, and you should be training to those specific risks that you actually encounter on a day-to-day business in whatever markets that you operate in. Here on number 4, we say management of supply chain. That really means your third parties. So, think about how are you training your third parties, and as you're monitoring them, are they living up to their reps and warranties in your contracts? Are they complying with your requirements? If they're not, you should be training them. That's going to give you information that's really valuable to your training program. The same with monitoring and measurement. And by this we really mean, you can't improve something that you're not measuring. So as you're looking across the categories of your compliance program, are you looking to see if they're working? A lot of companies will put a great program into place. They've got great policies. They think they have procedures, but then they don't take the extra step to figure out if people are actually following their procedures, if they're actually working. This actually is the area among the companies that we work with that we find sort of the weakest. And so, as you're monitoring, as you're looking for problems, as you're looking for weaknesses in your program, are you feeding that information back into your training? Is that something that you're thinking about? It certainly should be. And the same with the corrective action improvement, which is sort of the last of the 7 pillars of what we would consider an effective compliance program. When you see a problem and you fix it, what are you doing to ensure that doesn't happen again? And a lot of companies actually, sometimes they'll sort of anonymize these things, but they actually use this category, corrective action improvement, to train on. So, Farzad mentioned earlier, use specific instances, give scenarios. Don't just use sort of generic examples for companies. Maybe you can use examples of what's really gone wrong in your own company, without naming personal names, but that's really great fodder for your training program right there. When you know what the problems are that you're finding and how you're correcting them and moving forward, that's great information for your training program.
Yeah, we often get asked, so here's the basic training. What else should we bolster within this training? And we'll ask, well, what are your risks? And they say, well, the usual red flags. Have you had an audit report recently? Have you had an investigation recently? Yeah, we had a lot of people submitting expense reports over XY dollar amount. We had certain people not realizing that entities that were privatized still, the government still retained a share, therefore rendering them a government employee, government official. So things like that. Well, if those are your weaknesses, why don't we add some material either on the online training, do a live training session, communication, kind of lunch and learn type thing on those exact issues. Focus on who is a government official. Focus on royal families if you're doing a lot of business in the Middle East. Focus on, why gift giving is something we need to be careful of. There's nothing wrong with that. That's what's expected. And when you say, what are your own unique risks? Whatever your company is doing well and not well, that's what you have to focus on. It depends on the countries. It depends on if you have a large supply chain, small supply chain, lots of third parties on the outbound sales side or not. whatever those unique risks are, that's what you got to focus on.
Absolutely, and I see a question I thought we might just address here. So it's how do you test the effectiveness of an anti-bribery training program? So I've got a few ideas, but I know Farzad, as the real expert here, will have more. But this is a persistent challenge for companies. It's difficult, but there are a couple of ways that I see companies doing it. They look for the completion rates. We mentioned that earlier. If you've got a mandatory program, you have to pay attention to the completion rates. Are your folks actually taking the training? I think that post-training quiz that we mentioned earlier, sort of getting information from the folks who do your training as to whether it's helpful or not is another important thing to do. I've seen companies sort of ask for unsolicited feedback, so they just go and ask their employees, their managers, or their senior leaders, like, what did you think of the training? Is it working? And then, it's harder to do, but, looking for changes in behavior. You can look to see, if your hotline is more active or not after a training. I know I've heard people say, we gave a training and then we got a lot more information coming into our hotline, even if it wasn't information about a potential violation, but information about just questions, like how does this work? So you can look to see what's happening with your hotline. Those are some of my ideas. Do you have any others, Farzad, for measuring effectiveness?
Yeah, I think those are all great. I think the beefing up the quiz or the survey, the post-course survey, I think those are important. I think what really plays well are live meetings in this situation for the effectiveness. Maybe some cultures, it's not culturally appropriate to, for somebody to speak up and have an issue in a big group setting, in a team meeting. So maybe meeting with employees one-on-one, asking them, what did you think? Do you notice any of these things? Because countless times I've asked in a group setting, and everybody smiled and nodded, and then we broke out and I had one-on-ones, and they said, yeah, well, we often do XYZ activity, and it's the exact kind of thing that you didn't want them to do. It's a corruption risk, but they would never say it in front of their boss, in front of their colleagues. So sometimes just getting past some of the cultural nuances of a different country. Some people do like to speak about it in public because then they feel like, okay, we all do this. Is for our Formula One tickets okay? That kind of thing. Ask in front of everybody. And for those types of meetings, I often try to ask the manager, or the person in charge in the specific country, to actually ask some of the questions or answer some of the questions. That sometimes softens up the employees, letting them know that, yes, the manager's even helping out here. So that sometimes helps the employees participate.
We're getting really close to the end, and I really want to end on time for everybody. So I'm just going to go really quickly through these two slides, and then we'll go on to our sort of key takeaways. This is just the way in which we work with companies. We ask companies to sort of assess the maturity of those 7 process categories that you saw before and try to improve over time, because what you're really aiming for is continual improvement in your training program, in your policies, in your risk assessment across the board. And we know that change doesn't happen over time. If you're facing an event, that's a different story. But if you're trying to improve on an annual basis, we like to think in terms of maturity levels in each of those categories that I mentioned. And the way we work with companies is that we ask them to sort of do some self, think about their own program and do a self-assessment, sort of a baseline, and then we'll go in with an independent evaluation, which I think is really important. I think when you can, it's important to seek external verification just to make sure that your program is working the way you think it's working, because an independent evaluator may have a very different view, may see things that you don't see. So those, I think, are just important ways in which you can think about ensuring your program works, and in particular your training program. So key takeaways, top takeaways. I think, as we said before, these laws don't prohibit giving gifts or providing entertainment per se, but it's a really sticky area. And as far as I'd said, and I think you said it really well, you really just need to follow your own policy. Figure out what works for you in the markets in which you work, and follow your own policy, and make sure you're not making exceptions to your policy. you define what you think works for you and for your third parties. And I think we don't have it here, but I'll mention document all of this stuff. Make sure you've got records to evidence what you have done. Certainly, if you are making exceptions to your policy, you should have an articulable reason why. But I think documenting the decisions that you make is very, very important. Farzad, do you want to have the last word?
Oh boy, yes, I'll try to be profound. I think, again, particularly for those that are in-house, it's really about understanding how you guys do it. And once you understand and have that kind of meeting of the minds with your sales, marketing folks in the field, et cetera, I think that's where you can really come to a solid connection of here's our policy, here's what we expect from you, let's make it so we can both, do business here. So thank you, everybody, for joining today. A lot of people have asked if the materials would be available afterward, and the answer is yes. So thank you all for joining, and we look forward to another webinar with you. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Leslie. Great job.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.